Okay, language contact. Now we're going to talk a little bit about that and what happens when two languages or two or more languages meet up with each other. Human beings have been migrating, moving around, changing places since time immemorial, and it is to be expected that languages will affect each other, will come into contact, and that they will affect each other. And we'll talk about some of the major processes here. So imagine the situation of two communities of people who live in the same area, but they don't share a language. So how do they handle the situation? So imagine, for instance, way back when, at the beginning of time, when you had one group of nomads were wandering around speaking language A, and another group of nomads were wandering around speaking language B, and they both wind up in the same place. Do they just sort of look at each other, or do they actually try to communicate? Well, if they're human beings, they're probably going to try to communicate. But how? What are they going to do? Well, they could ignore each other, but that's like such a non-human thing to do that it's unlikely that they would do it. They could use gestures, in fact. That's entirely possible, sort of point at things, but that sort of doesn't really go very far. I mean, you could do some very rudimentary things with that. I mean, think about it. If you're trying to communicate with someone who doesn't speak the same language, you know, as happens sometimes if you're asking directions or if you're traveling, whatever, and you don't speak the same language, you try to use gestures, but the conversation's really going to stay at a really, really superficial level. There's not a whole lot you can do. Or you find out what that third language is. But this is definitely a possibility, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. You could learn each other's language, two-way bilingualism. So the speakers of language A learn language B, and the speakers of language B learn language A. This takes time. It can happen, but it takes a lot of time. So, but it's a possibility, definitely there. Or one community learns the language of the other. This is what happens if you've got one community that's dominant. So if there were a whole lot of speakers of language A and not very many speakers of language B, then probably the speakers of language B would learn language A. However, there's going to be influence. Some of their words, some of their structures are going to sneak into the language, much as the speakers of language A may not want that to happen. It will, because that's what languages do. Okay? Or they could invent a language. That's even more fun. And in fact, what we see is that that happens actually quite a bit. All of these situations are entirely possible. All of them have happened in history. I mean, ignoring each other is if you're both sort of traveling, you're two ships that pass in the night, you're not going to interact very much. But again, this is not a real human thing to do. Using gestures is very nice if it's for a very short amount of time. The third language, obviously, you have to somehow figure out what that third language is that everyone knows. The other two, learning each other's language, or that one community learns the language of the other, those take time, as does inventing a language. And we'll talk a little bit more, because the inventing the language is an awful lot of fun. So, a lingua franca. This might be, for instance, the third language, as was mentioned. It's an auxiliary language used for communication between groups who speak different languages. But lingua franca essentially is a widespread language. This is not going to be some obscure little language that has maybe a dozen speakers. This is something that is spoken across the globe, usually by communities that are fairly powerful, either politically or economically. So, for instance, there are natural languages. English and French are lingua francas. In fact, there is even a variety of English now that's called international English, that is spoken by people who do not have English as their native language, but they use that language to communicate. This is what you'll find very frequently in business meetings, at scientific conferences, that kind of thing, where they speak that particular variety of English, international English. You've also got French, which serves an international function also. French is the language of the Olympics. It's the language of the circus, surprisingly enough. Really, it is. And of the post office. Who knew? But there it is. But French is an important language, and it's one that's used a lot. There are other lingua francas that are used very much. Spanish is probably moving up there too, in terms of being a language that's got an international function, simply because there are so many speakers that are spread all over. So you've got Spanish speakers in all of South America, you've got in North America, and you've got some in Europe. Swahili is regionally important as a trade language, so it's not used all over the world in the sense that you're not going to have scientific conferences that are being held in Swahili. However, if you're traveling in Africa, especially in Eastern Africa, it's a good idea to know Swahili. This is what's going to get you around. So it's got, for instance, 5 to 10 million native speakers, but 30 million users as a second language. So a lot of people speak this language. Another possibility is invented languages, such as Esperanto. Now, Esperanto is a language that was founded with the idea of creating a language that does not have a state, because whenever you start getting the notion of nationhood and statehood, that's where you start getting, things start getting nasty, or can at least. So Esperanto was supposed to be like the language of humans, spoken by everyone, and that's not attached to any particular state or any particular political system, so that it would be nice and neutral. It's not really caught on that much. People do speak it. There are still some speakers. There are Esperanto societies and all that, but it does not have the spread of either English or French or even Swahili. Okay, so let's look, for instance, at Esperanto 101 and take a look at what you notice. So let's just see. Okay, inteligente person lernis la lingvon Esperanto rapid kaj facil. Esperanto estas la moderna kultura lingvo por la tuto mondo. Simple, fleksebla, besona, ĝi estas la praktika solvo de la problemo de universala interkompreno. Esperanto meritas vian seriozan konsideron. Lernu la internacian lingvon Esperanto. Okay, so most of you are learning Spanish, or most of you speak Spanish, so you can figure this one out pretty easily. And what do you notice? So, for one thing, there's a few things with it. It's nice and regular. You don't find all kinds of things. There's only la, to indicate the definite article. Okay, adjectives end in a, nouns end in o. Okay, so adjective, adjective, adjective. Estás, as is the way you end the verbs. So nice seriozan. Interesting about why this is, because moderna cultura, okay, but seriozan, there's got to be a reason for this. Your serious consideration. Okay, lernu la internacion lingvon Esperanto. Now, what you see is that this is very, very clearly based on Romance languages. It's totally a Romance language. If you speak Spanish, you got no problem with this. If you speak French, you got no problem with this. English has a lot of words. 25,000 words in English come from French. So you can probably figure this one out pretty much. If you're speaking German, if you're speaking Russian, this becomes a little further away. If you're speaking Chinese or any other Asian language, this is not going to be any simpler than learning anything else. So it's, even though the idea was good, that it's based on not having a particular state, the fact is that this really, really privileges the Romance language. Okay. Let's talk about the idea of multilingualism, because that's kind of an ideal. We talk about how great it would be to be multilingual, etc. Well, bilingualism is actually much more common than monolingualism. There's very, very, very few countries that are actually monolingual. Most places are at least bilingual in the sense, in various senses that we'll talk about. Okay, so if we look at this, we can see that there are about 200 distinct national entities, about 200 different countries in the world, but there are approximately 6,000 languages, give or take a few hundred here or there. So obviously, some places are going to have to deal with more than one language, okay? And one thing I want to clarify here is the idea of officially bilingual or multilingual countries. So in a country such as Canada, for instance, which is officially bilingual, okay, or Switzerland, which is officially multilingual, or Belgium, which is again officially bilingual, what you're going to find is that this is the language of administration usually, so both languages. In Canada, all laws, anything that is official has to come out in both French and in English. In Switzerland, everything has to come out in all four languages that are spoken there. So Italian, French, German, and Romansh. And also, same thing in Belgium, where you're going to have Flemish and French. Both of those are going to be official languages, so used in all official documentation. Signs in the streets, et cetera, that kind of thing are all going to be in both languages. But it doesn't mean that everyone speaks both languages or all four languages or however many. Okay, there's an awful lot of monolinguals wandering around Canada who speak either only English or only French. There's a lot of them. So the country is officially bilingual, but that doesn't mean that the inhabitants, the individual humans living inside the country, are bilingual. So that's something to keep in mind when we talk about that. Now let's talk about individual bilingualism. So what does it mean? When you hear that someone is bilingual, what does that mean in your head? Okay? Does it mean basically native-like fluency in two or more languages, meaning that you can just speak one language as well as the other? Essentially two monolinguals occupying the same body, okay? Where you have the same level of competence in both languages, where you could just switch between Spanish and French, or English and Spanish, or English and French just as easily as anyone else, as anyone who speaks just one language. And that you can handle it in all registers and in all situations. That's the tricky part, okay? Or does it mean that you've got your native language plus some knowledge of another language? So essentially, your basic student finishing the language requirement after 2 years. Do you consider them to be bilingual or not? And it's basically, individual bilingualism is really an ability to meet communicative goals in two or more languages. So basically having a smattering, some ideas of another language, getting through second year, the language requirement is probably not going to get you to bilingual. It's getting you on the path to it, but not completely there. Keep in mind, though, that you're not going to have equal proficiency. That usually what happens is that you learn certain vocabulary in one language and not in the other. So and we'll talk about that kind of situation a little bit later when we talk about diglossia, okay, where you've got, for instance, the home vocabulary for the house, but then you have vocabulary for your work, and they're going to be different because you learn them in different situations. So, monolingual USA. People like to say, you know, we've all heard the old joke, okay, that a Canadian is bilingual, or someone who speaks two languages is bilingual. Someone who speaks more than two languages is a polyglot, and someone who speaks only one language is an American. Well, you know, actually, that's not like completely true. If we look at ethnologue.com, what we see is that the 2016 census showed us that of a population of about 325 million, it's probably gone up since then, but we've got 325 million wandering around here. Okay, and we've got a lot of languages that are spoken. We've got some official languages. This Hawaiian, for instance, in Hawaii, and Spanish is an official language in Mexico. We live in the Southwest here, or at least those of us who work at ASU do. You guys are all sort of all over the place. But you know, if I'm living here in Arizona, then I walk down the street and there are Spanish speakers because because of where we are. So to say that we're strictly monolingual is really not completely true. If we look now, this is kind of the problem of getting statistics about languages. So here, for instance, they say the number of individual languages for the United States, this is an ethnologue according to the census, is 232 languages. So there's 219 living languages, 13 are extinct, meaning that we can read them, for instance, or they used to exist, but now the last living speaker of that language died. Of the living languages, 195 are indigenous, okay, meaning languages that Native American languages or Inuit languages, and 24 are non-indigenous, English, Spanish, French, German, Italian, all those other languages that come in. 3 are institutional. Institutional means that they're used outside of just the community. Okay, but they're also used in schools, they're used in churches, they're used by the government. Okay, then 12 are developing, so they're becoming more important. 1 is vigorous, 58 are in trouble, 145 are dying. So there's a lot of languages. If you click on the next link, however, what you see here, I'll leave you to click on the link. It is from businessinsider.com, and it talks about the borough of Queens in New York. Now, the borough Queens is New York City is divided into 5 boroughs, and Queens is actually the largest borough in terms of area. It is not the largest borough in terms of humans actually living there. That honor belongs to Brooklyn. But Queens is interesting because it is the single most linguistically diverse area in the entire US. And I think they indicate that it's even in the world. But there's like 600 languages being spoken in Queens. Okay, so click on that, take a look at the website. It's really interesting to look at, okay, to see what it is that they consider languages, because really here, if we're looking at the number 232, the question is, are we dealing with languages or are we dealing with dialects? And remember, we had the discussion about languages and dialects and what that means. But the Business Insider article here on Queens is really interesting and worth looking at. So why is there multilingualism in the US? Well, immigration, okay? We're a nation of immigrants. People have come in. We've all heard stories about Ellis Island way back when, people coming in from Italy, from Ireland, from wherever else. More recently, a lot of people coming in from the Southwest. There's also the fact that as we expanded westward, okay, there were, the US then took over some territories that already had people speaking on them. And of course, they were the Native American languages, the indigenous languages. And those are not just the Native American languages, but also think about in Alaska, for instance, the Inuit languages. So in Canada, they refer to those as First Nations, and that puts the Native American and the Inuit languages all together. And of course, native languages or new languages can be born. And here, this is kind of an interesting issue. So is AAVE, African American Vernacular English, is that a language? Or is Spanglish a language? I mean, think about it. Think about the design imperatives for a language, what it is that you use a language for. But there's also the issue of a language is a dialect with an army and a navy. So depending on which definition you use, AAVE could be a language or not. So, and same thing with Spanglish. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, depending on the definition that you use. Okay, there's societal bilingualism, and that means, for instance, that individual speakers who are bilingual tend to use their languages in distinct, non-overlapping domains. So that means, for instance, you speak one language at home and another language at work. because at work nobody else speaks Spanish, for instance, but at home this is what you're going to speak to your parents because that's what you've always spoken to them, and it's really weird to suddenly start speaking English to them. Okay, so you'll have different domains and the two don't really overlap, or there might be a little bit of overlap, but not very, very much. Okay. In communities with significant populations, the domain specificity of the language gets reflected on a community-wide level. So again, that means, for instance, that there might be, you use one language in social situations and another one in professional situations. Okay? But again, this is where you've got significant populations of bilingual individuals who speak the same two languages. Okay, if you've got a whole bunch of different languages spoken, well, then you've got other things happening. So diglossia, okay, is a sociolinguistic situation in which two languages or two varieties of a single language, okay, coexist and develop specialized domains of use. So for instance, the L language tends to be used at home, in private, with family and friends. And the H language tends to be used in public for education and business. So for instance, if we look at, in my own situation, for instance, I tend to speak English with my friends who don't speak French. And I tend to use it at work when I'm going to the store. When I'm dealing with most people on a professional basis, then I'm going to speak English. However, the L language is French, and that's what I use at home. That's what I use to speak with my parents. That's what I use to speak with my children. That's what I don't use it to speak with my husband because he doesn't speak French. But essentially, there are two specific domains. You'll find that also, for instance, when we say varieties of a single language, you'll see this, for instance, especially with speakers of African American vernacular English. There's one place where you speak the standard variety of English, if you will, for lack of a better word. And then African American vernacular English is what you're going to speak with your husband, with your spouse, rather, with your kids, with your parents, with your friends, in certain situations. So there are places to use the languages. By the way, there's a movie out now called Sorry for Bothering You, which is really interesting. It's been getting good reviews, and it deals with exactly this kind of situation. So speakers will base their language choice along the lines of these particular specializations, and it has consequences for access. So for instance, if you don't speak the H language, you're not going to have the kind of access to education and to professional opportunities that you would have if you don't speak the H language. There is an imbalance in functions. So one language tends to have prestige functions. Okay, so the more there's seems to be more prestigious, okay, or is assumed by society to be more prestigious. This does not mean that it's a better language or a worse language, okay? We talk about prestige, which is something that is given by society. It's a social construct, okay? It's not anything inherent in the language itself, okay? And it tends to lead to one-way bilingualism. So the subordinate community learns the language of the dominant community, but there's relatively little bilingualism within the dominant community. So this has to do, for instance, with the for instance, in Haitian Creole, although actually the Creole example upends this because the dominant community does speak some Creole, but not very much. But it's the subordinate community that speaks only Creole, doesn't speak French, and the higher community also speaks French. Anyway, or the wealthier community rather than higher. If there are bilingual speakers but no diglossia, it could lead to language attrition in the sense that why maintain both languages? If one language will do everything that you need to do and it fulfills especially professional and economic needs, then there's no reason to maintain both languages. And Therefore, language attrition tends to occur either on a social level, where you've got language death, or, for instance, on a personal level. For instance, we know with immigrants that there's a pattern that tends to be followed, which is that the immigrant family comes in, they tend to speak their native language. The next generation tends to be bilingual in both languages. And then the third generation tends to speak the ambient language and has forgotten the grandparents' native language. And this is something that happens an awful lot. Another thing that I'd like to bring up is the idea that you're going to also have one dominant language. Even if you're bilingual and you speak two languages, one language is going to dominate. You'll speak one more than the other, or you'll speak it better than the other. One way to test is to see what language you use when you count, when you do math. Okay? Keep in mind, reciting numbers and counting are two different things. So you can learn to count from 1 to 10 in Spanish. I can do that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But I can't, if you're asking me to do math, I'm going to have to do it in English. Okay? So that's something to keep in mind too, that you might be able to speak both languages, but there's always going to be one that dominates. Pidgins and Creoles. Okay, those are a lot of fun. These are created languages. And pidgins, well, nobody is a native speaker of the pidgin. There are some languages now, like 𝒸𝒾𝑒𝓉𝓎, for instance, which is called a pidgin, but it isn't. It's really a Creole. Okay, it's just kept the name. And the contact is for specific purposes, so to trade goods, to plant and to raise crops. Okay, there's, for instance, Russonorsk, which is spoken up in Norway and Russia, and it allows Russian and Norwegian fishermen to talk to each other. And basically, the vocabulary is limited to fish and water things. Excuse me. So users only use the pidgin when they are in the contact situation, and all other communication will be in various native languages. Okay, so if you're interacting with the other community, then you use the pidgin. But if you're not with the other community, then you don't use the pidgin. Okay, and the pidgin is no longer used if there is no more contact between the two communities. So characteristics of pidgin languages: simple but systematic grammar. Okay, so essentially it's not just random throwing out words and throwing out tenses, that kind of thing. The grammar is simple, but it's systematic. There are rules simply because we're human beings and that's what we want to do. There's going to be some lexical variation from the two languages that contribute to it, but the domains are restricted. Okay, so for instance, in Russonorsk, it's about basically fishing and water kind of stuff. Okay, generally in these kinds of contexts, there'll be a dominant and a subordinate language. Okay, the vocabulary usually comes from the dominant language, the phonology from the subordinate language. The grammar may come from the subordinate language, or it may reflect what's called the bioprogram, and that is the innate universal grammar. So remember we had talked a little bit about universal grammar? It doesn't mean that all languages are exactly the same, but what it means is that they all have the same basic structure. It then gets elaborated, but they all start with the basic structure. So you can see those in pidgin languages. So if we look at pidgin vocabulary, for instance, let's look at 𝒸𝒾𝑒𝓉𝓎. Okay, this is just the vocabulary. You can see that the 𝒸𝒾𝑒𝓉𝓎 word, like grass, for instance, it can mean grass, but it also means hair and feather. Think about it. They use one word in order to have several different meanings. Okay, so the vocabulary is not going to be very elaborate. There's going to be a whole lot of semantic value in any one word. Okay, 𝒾𝑒𝓉 means carry, but it also means to give birth. 𝒶 means neck, but it also means voice. 𝒶𝑝𝑎 means father or owner. 𝒶𝑚𝑏𝑢 means taboo or parents-in-law. Okay, we're not even going to get into that. Okay, 𝑏𝑢n means bone and strength. You can see the relationship except for taboo and parents-in-law. I had great parents-in-law, so I don't see why they would be taboo. But But we could see that there is some kind of relationship between all of these words. So it shows how important context is in interpreting the message. Okay, so you can't just be speaking Pidgin to each other with absolutely no context. The interpretation depends on where you are and what it is that you're doing. Okay, so for instance, in Hawaiian Pidgin, 𝒔𝓃𝑒 𝒑𝒾𝑒𝑒, it could be, he bought my coffee, he made a check out to me, I bought his coffee, I made a check out to him. Okay, it kind of depends on what the context is, what the situation is, and you have to know an awful lot of the situation. Context is important. Okay, so can you understand Pidgin? Try this. So this was written to Mr. Comyns, a British missionary in the New Hebrides in 1889. Misi Kamesi. Dear Mr. Comyns, Arelu, how are you? Juno kamu riki mi no ruki you. We haven't seen each other in some time. Ju ruku mai poti iko mai tate. Please keep a lookout for a boat to Mai today. 𝕶𝓃𝑒𝓉𝓎 𝒸𝒾𝑒𝓉𝓎. Can he sleep at your house? He's watching my vote for me. I'm out of supplies and I'm hungry now. The man on the boat to Mai will give you some very good yams. The tobacco that you gave me is gone, completely used up. 𝕶𝓃𝓉𝓎. See you soon. Creoles are generally defined as second-generation Pidgins, and the primary distinguishing characteristic of Creoles is that they have native speakers. Pidgins don't have native speakers, Creoles do. So what happens? This is, for instance, when you have two groups of people, so a stability of community, two groups of people who come into contact and they do what people do, which is they fall in love, they get married, they have kids. Okay, the only language that they share is the Pidgin. The kids born are going to speak the Pidgin because that's the only language, but it's their native language. And then what happens is that with each generation, the kids are the ones that elaborate the language, increase the vocabulary, increase the grammar. It's really fascinating to see. So Tok Pisin, for instance, arose in the context of different Pacific Islanders coming together to work on plantations in Papua New Guinea. So different Pacific Islanders, different groups, they're working on plantations, they have to talk to each other. Haitian Creole, for instance, came the same way because there were a lot of slaves who were brought over from Africa. And what happened? Well, the slave owners separated the groups out because they did not want to have too many people from one language group, because then they might actually talk to each other, communicate, and foment rebellion. And as it turns out, what people did is what people do. They created a Pidgin, which then became a Creole, which then became Haitian Creole. And then they fomented rebellion, and Haiti became the first Black Republic. These things happen. So this is what Creoles can do. So they innovate. They innovate once a group of native speakers emerges, they innovate in order to express distinctions. The languages just get more and more developed. So if we're looking at Creole, okay, I chop, I eat. I been chop, I ate. I did chop, I am eating. I been the chop, I was eating. So all of this tells you that the language is getting more distinct. Why are you making the distinction? Okay, granted, I eat, I ate. Okay, but I am eating, making the distinction between I eat and I am eating, I ate and I was eating. Those are more subtle distinctions that are created later that come into the language. What's interesting is that Creole languages tend to look the same, no matter which languages are in contact or where they form. So that's a really interesting thing. So according to Bickerton, it's the bio program, the universal grammar, that essentially Creoles reflect the grammar, the fundamental grammar that is the basis of all human languages that we are born with. Monogenesis says that Sabir, which is a Portuguese-based Creole, was relexified. In other words, that different colonizers, that the language itself spread around the world and new words got put into it, but that the grammar stayed. But how did this particular language spread around the globe? There's a lot of things that just don't work with this particular theory. It is one that exists, but it has too many problems when you think about it, especially like who's teaching the Sabir, the Portuguese-based Creole anyway? There's a whole lot of issues that you want to get into this. So the bio program is the most likely reason for similarity in structure. So let's look at this. So for instance, we look at Hawaiian Creole, we look at Sranan, okay, and Haitian Creole. Haitian Creole is a French-based Creole. He walk, I walka, we could see that. Li marché, okay. He had walked, he been walk, a ben waka. L'ité marché, okay. He will walk, he go walk, asa waka. Lava marché. Continuous, he was walking, hete walk, ate walk, lap marché, okay. And if you look a little bit further, you could see that the structures are very, very similar, okay, which is really cool and very, it's a credit to human creativity and how we can create languages from, well, a lot of these come from contact, they might come from adversity, but it's really cool that these languages can be created.